The room went quiet the second the word left his mouth. Not because it was loud, but because everyone understood what it meant. A white mob boss had just called Bumpy Johnson the N-word in public, with witnesses, daring him to do what everyone expected him to do next. If you're enjoying stories like this, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. It happened in Harlem, late 1940s, in a back room that smelled like cigar smoke and cheap whiskey. The kind of place where deals were made quietly, and men disappeared quietly too. The boss who said it wasn't drunk. He wasn't joking. He was smiling. A tight, confident smile that said he believed the room belonged to him. He believed Harlem belonged to him, and he believed that no matter how powerful Bumpy Johnson was, no black man would ever cross that line without paying for it in blood. Everyone else in the room froze. Hands stopped moving. Conversations died mid-sentence. They all waited for the same thing, Bumpy's gun. Because that's how this always ended. An insult like that was a death sentence, and everybody knew it. If Bumpy let it slide, he'd be finished. Word would spread. The streets would decide he was weak. Harlem would eat him alive. But Bumpy Johnson didn't reach for his gun. He didn't even stand up. He sat there, calm, eyes steady, breathing slow. A man who had survived prison, assassins, crooked cops, and rivals who wanted his head mounted on a wall didn't react the way anyone expected. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He didn't smile either. He simply looked at the man who insulted him, like he was measuring something invisible. Bumpy was smaller than most of the men in that room. He wasn't built like an enforcer. He didn't look like a killer. He wore tailored suits, spoke softly, quoted poetry. But every person there knew the truth. This was the man who controlled Harlem's numbers racket, the man who decided who ate and who didn't, the man who paid rent for families during the Depression and ordered hits with the same calm voice he used to greet old ladies on the street. The mob boss expected rage. What he got instead was silence. Bumpy leaned back in his chair and let the moment stretch. Seconds felt like minutes. The insult hung in the air, sour and dangerous. Someone near the door shifted their weight, ready to move when the shooting started. Another man stared at the floor, not wanting to be the first witness. Then Bumpy spoke, not loudly, not angrily. He said, "You finished?" The question confused the room. The boss frowned, still smiling, but now there was something else behind his eyes. Uncertainty. He'd thrown the sharpest knife he had, and Bumpy hadn't bled. That wasn't how this was supposed to go. Bumpy stood up slowly. Still no gun. He adjusted his jacket, buttoned it, and stepped closer. Not into the man's space, just close enough to make sure every word landed. "You think a word makes you powerful," Bumpy said. "That's why you need to say it out loud." No one interrupted him. No one dared. Bumpy glanced around the room at the men who depended on him, the men who feared him, the men who secretly wondered if this was the moment his reign ended. Then he looked back at the mob boss. "But power," he continued, "is when you don't have to say anything at all." The boss laughed, short and sharp, trying to recover. He made a joke, brushed it off, pretended the moment hadn't slipped out of his control. The meeting moved on. Drinks were poured. Voices slowly returned. But something had changed. The insult hadn't been answered with violence, and that unsettled everyone more than a gunshot ever could. What the mob boss didn't understand, what no one in that room understood yet, was that Bumpy Johnson had already decided his fate. Not with a bullet, not that night, but in a way that would follow him long after the echo of that word faded. Bumpy Johnson left that room knowing exactly what would happen next, because men like that mob boss always made the same mistake. They believed respect lived in fear, and fear lived in violence. They believed survival meant striking first and loudest. They believed that if a black man didn't explode when insulted, it meant he had nothing inside him. What they never understood was that Bumpy Johnson didn't run Harlem with anger. He ran it with memory and patience and leverage. The insult followed him out into the street that night, but it didn't sit on his shoulders. It went into his head and stayed there, filed away, not as rage but as information. Bumpy knew something most gangsters never learned. The man who insults you publicly wants you to react publicly because a reaction ends the game. A gunshot closes a story. Bumpy wasn't interested in closing anything. He wanted it to keep going. In the days that followed, he said nothing about the incident. No threats, no warnings, no retaliation that anyone could see. That silence traveled faster than bullets. It made people uneasy because violence they understood. Silence meant something else was moving underneath. Italians in Harlem started noticing small changes. A delivery delayed here, a phone call not returned there. A favor that usually came through suddenly got stuck in paperwork. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal on paper, just friction. Where things once flowed, they now slowed. Bumpy didn't give orders with shouting. He made suggestions and Harlem listened because Harlem trusted him. He paid attention to who needed what and who depended on whom. The numbers, runners, the bar owners, the landlords, the union guys, the police captains who liked envelopes more than paperwork. All of it formed a web, and Bumpy sat at the center of it, calm and observant. The mob boss who had insulted him didn't notice at first. He was used to obstacles. Italy-bred men who thought pressure was normal. But this wasn't pressure. This was isolation. He'd walk into rooms where conversations stopped not out of fear, but because no one knew what to say to him anymore. Old allies suddenly became busy. Men who once laughed loud at his jokes now smiled thin and checked their watches. He tried pushing back, calling in favors, reminding people who he was. The responses were polite and useless. Bumpy never told anyone to turn on him. He simply stopped making things easy. And in Harlem, easy was everything. Bumpy understood that power wasn't about how many men would die for you. It was about how many men would quietly stop answering your calls without you knowing why. Week by week, the mob boss felt it. Contracts shrank. Territory blurred. Cops who once looked the other way now took their time. A raid here, an inspection there. Nothing that screamed retaliation but enough to bleed him slowly. He asked around. He demanded answers. He even asked if this was about that night. The response was always the same. Blank faces and shrugs. Bumpy Johnson's name was never mentioned. That was the point. The insult had been loud. The response was invisible, and that invisibility terrified him more than a threat ever could because there was nothing to shoot at, nothing to threaten back, no single man to confront. Bumpy didn't need to humiliate him publicly. He let him feel small privately. That was worse, because every man in that world knew what was happening, even if no one said it out loud. They saw how Harlem moved around Bumpy and how it slowly closed its doors on anyone who crossed him without him lifting a hand. And that's when the mob boss finally understood the truth he should have known from the start. That night wasn't mercy, it was a decision. The realization didn't come all at once. It crept in late at night when the phones stopped ringing and the rooms felt bigger than they should have. The mob boss started waking up with the sense that something had shifted and left him behind. He retraced conversations, replayed faces, searched for the moment he'd lost control. He kept coming back to Harlem and to Bumpy Johnson sitting still while everyone waited for violence. That calm had been the warning. He just hadn't understood it yet. Now he did. Because men who rule through fear can see their enemies. Men who rule through structure erase you without ever stepping into the light. He tried to force a confrontation. That was his world. Face to face. Man to man. He sent word that he wanted to talk neutral ground. Same room, different night. The message reached Bumpy the same way everything did, quietly through people who trusted him. Bumpy didn't refuse. He didn't rush either. He waited long enough for the other man to feel desperate. That was always the difference between them. When they finally sat down again, the energy was different. No audience, no smirks, no confidence. Bumpy arrived alone, no visible weapon, same tailored suit, same calm eyes. The mob boss talked first. That alone said everything. He complained about misunderstandings, about business being disrupted, about people acting strange. He never apologized. That wasn't how his kind survived. Bumpy listened without interrupting, hands folded, breathing slow. When the man finished, Bumpy nodded once as if confirming something he already knew. He didn't bring up the insult. He didn't need to. He spoke about roots and numbers and neighborhoods, about how Harlem worked when it was respected and how it shut down when it wasn't. His voice stayed even, never rising, never sharp. The mob boss tried to push back to reassert dominance, but every sentence sounded thinner than the last. He was arguing with a man who wasn't emotional, and that terrified him because emotion was leverage, and Bumpy offered none. At one point, the mob boss said the word again. Not as an insult this time, but as a challenge, like bait tossed into still water. He wanted to see if it would finally provoke something. Bumpy's expression didn't change. He simply said, "You already used that," and it didn't work. The room felt colder after that. Bumpy stood, adjusted his jacket, and ended the meeting without a threat, without a deal, without resolution. That was the final blow, because unresolved power is heavier than declared war. In the weeks that followed, the mob boss's world kept shrinking, not dramatically, not violently, but steadily. He lost influence in Harlem entirely, then in nearby neighborhoods, then with his own people who began to sense weakness. The streets are animals. They smell it early. Bumpy never claimed victory. He didn't need to. The message spread on its own, that if you crossed Bumpy Johnson, he wouldn't rush. He wouldn't explode. He would let you keep breathing while your world quietly collapsed. That lesson traveled farther than any gunshot ever could. And long after that mob boss faded into memory, Harlem remembered the night a man chose not to pull a trigger and proved exactly why he never had to. What most people never saw was what happened inside Harlem after that lesson settled in. Bumpy didn't celebrate. He didn't tell the story. He didn't allow it to become legend yet, because legends attract attention and attention attracts chaos. He went back to routine, walked the same streets, spoke to the same shop owners, sat in the same clubs with the same quiet presence. But people looked at him differently now, not with fear. That had always been there, but with understanding. They realized something fundamental about how he operated. Bumpy wasn't reacting to disrespect. He was managing outcomes. That distinction mattered. In Harlem, survival had always been loud. You survived by striking first, by making noise, by showing teeth. But Bumpy had built a system where survival depended on cooperation and memory. He remembered who paid. He remembered who protected. He remembered who crossed lines, and he never forgot timing. That's why the insult mattered less than when it happened. It had happened in front of witnesses. It had happened from a man who believed whiteness and power were interchangeable. And Bumpy understood that killing him would turn the story into exactly what the Italians wanted: a violent black man who couldn't control himself. That narrative was older than Harlem itself. Bumpy refused to feed it. Instead, he let the streets tell a different story. A story where the man who insulted him stayed alive but lost everything that made him dangerous. Businessmen stopped using his name as leverage. Police stopped tipping him off ahead of raids. Union muscle stopped showing up on time, then stopped showing up at all. It wasn't betrayal, it was self-preservation, because aligning with Bumpy meant stability, and aligning against him meant slow suffocation. No one announced that choice. They just made it quietly, one by one. And the most brutal part was that Bumpy never took credit. When people asked why things were changing, he'd shrug or redirect or change the subject. That denial made the power feel bigger, because it wasn't tied to ego. It was structural. It existed whether he acknowledged it or not. The mob boss tried one last move months later. He pushed for violence not against Bumpy, but against people around him, hoping to provoke retaliation, hoping to force a gun into Bumpy's hand. That was the final mistake. Because Bumpy didn't respond with rage, he responded with containment. He made sure the violence led nowhere, that it produced no benefit, no territory, no profit. The men who carried it out found themselves isolated, arrested, or unemployed, not because Bumpy ordered it, but because no one protected them afterward. That was when the message became permanent. You could be violent in Harlem, but violence without permission led to nothing, and permission came from Bumpy. The mob boss faded after that. Not killed, not jailed, not publicly disgraced. He simply stopped mattering. And in that world, not mattering was worse than dying. Bumpy continued on, quietly balancing alliances, navigating politics, surviving prison returns and assassination attempts, all without changing the core rule he lived by. He didn't need to prove strength. He needed to preserve order. That night in the smoky back room became a private reference point among men who understood power. It wasn't repeated loudly. It was remembered silently. And when younger hustlers asked older ones why Bumpy Johnson was different, they didn't talk about guns or bodies. They talked about patience. They talked about restraint. They talked about the night a man was insulted in front of everyone and chose to answer later in a way no one could fight. That was the moment many realized that real power didn't shout. It waited, and by the time you heard it, it was already too late to do anything about it. There was no celebration after that story settled into Harlem because Bumpy never allowed moments like that to become trophies. He understood something deeper than reputation. He understood sustainability. Every gangster could create fear for a season. Very few could create balance for decades. That balance was what kept Harlem from tearing itself apart under outside pressure and internal greed. It wasn't kindness. It wasn't charity. It was strategy. Bumpy knew that if his people felt protected, they wouldn't need to prove themselves every day with violence. That night, with the mob boss, became part of an unspoken code. Not written, not announced, but absorbed. If you came into Harlem, you came correct. If you disrespected its people, you didn't get noise in return. You got distance. And distance was deadly because distance meant no protection, no information, no leverage. You were alone. And in that world, being alone was the fastest way to disappear without ever vanishing. Bumpy didn't teach that lesson with speeches. He taught it by example by choosing restraint when everyone expected blood. That choice reshaped how power was measured around him. Men stopped asking how dangerous he was. They started asking how far his reach extended. That question mattered more, because danger fades with age. Reach multiplies. The insult that started it all became irrelevant once its purpose was exposed. It was never about the word. It was about control. And control was the one thing Bumpy Johnson never surrendered. Not to Italians, not to the streets, not to expectation. That's why his legacy isn't defined by the bodies he ordered or the enemies he outlived. It's defined by moments like that one where he proved that real dominance doesn't react. It calculates, and when the calculation is finished, there's nothing left for the other side to do but fade quietly out of the picture while the world keeps moving without them.